Getting us in real time. Thank you. Take two. Good evening. Welcome to Gardens at NYCHA, presented by GrowNYC, our February takeover, Ancestral Foods Roundtable Talk. Next slide. We are GrowNYC, and we are committed to protecting the environment. We curate green spaces. We motivate people to live healthy, and hopefully we're making a positive impact as we do this together. This is who we are, and the next slide tells you what we do. Feel free to join us at grownyc.org to learn more. Next slide. Everyone, I could not be more excited. I am so amped. I am so pumped right now. You're going to see me talking with my hands. That's just me. Don't judge, because I'm excited. My heart is literally about to come out of my mouth because I have been waiting for this. More specifically, welcome to the Gardens at NYCHA February Takeover virtual event. My co-founder, Chantel Kemp, who you will hear more about soon. The metaphorical seed to uplift the history of the diaspora in food and agriculture actually started with us 2 years ago. And then last season, we invited our esteemed mentor, the iconic Tutu, who you will also hear from. And when we talked for weeks about what could just a conversation about the diaspora looked like, it of course had to include food and agriculture. So many things came up. And then in this 24th season, 2024, we said, we got it. And what it looked like for us was a takeover. Now, it's important that while messaging denotes that it's a February takeover, we uplift that Black history and history of the diaspora is every day, not just in February and not just for 29 days. But in this instance, we are excited that our parent partner, GrowNYC, has joined us to uplift this effort where every day in February and beyond, you will see new posts celebrating everyday heroes, Black history pioneers, ones to watch who are taking the baton and helping us build legacy for the future. Join us at GrowNYC IG Live to see the amazing replay of the Island Bee Project, the 3 Latina Afro-Caribbean beekeeping ladies who talk to us about bees in the diaspora, the importance of bees, pollinators, and medical medicine right there in the garden, and more. Keep following us at GrowNYC, and you'll see our contact information at the end of this presentation so you can learn more about Gardens at NYCHA events throughout the season. Next slide. In this workshop tonight, let me dial that back. This isn't a workshop, this is a conversation. In this room, in this conversation tonight, Chantel, Tutu, and I are going to walk you through some of those beginning conversations that we had last season that brought us to this very room tonight. We're going to jump right into our roundtable talk, which will involve esteemed guests and my fellow panelists talking about food and movement across many spaces. Literally, the movement of food, as we started with the ancestors in Africa, as it traveled throughout the diaspora of Central, South America, the Caribbean, the US, and more. But we're also going to talk about the metaphorical movement of food in spiritual, cultural, many other AL spaces that work for you, and maybe ones that don't work for you. Lastly, it's important as we have these conversations that we are always communicating. And when we do that, we're talking about what it means to reshape communication. And specifically, that means tonight, what it means to design, redesign, and reshape food narratives. Food narratives that weren't selected by us to begin with. Food narratives that are often misrepresented and undervalued. And in this room, we get the chance to use our voices to say what our food narratives are for us. Next slide. It is my honor, it is my pleasure to introduce my co-founder of the Gardens at NYCHA program, our esteemed mentor, our co-facilitator, and our special featured guest, Chantel.
Thank you for that beautiful introduction, DK. I'm so excited. I'm so excited for everyone that is here today. These are the facilitators that are going to be myself and DK, Tutu, Badaru, my love. Corey is in the chat with you guys. And also our very special guest, Robert Bowden, who needs a lot of introduction and is so profound. And I am so blessed and so honored that he's here today to talk to us about his experience with food, his experience being in the food space, and whatever knowledge that he decides to grant to us tonight, because he's just so prolific. And so very, very excited to walk with you guys, to do this food movement and food journey together. And start to reshape our food narratives and start to understand our relationships to food and why we have those relationships and how we can create new ones. So we want to jump into community agreements, and I'm going to pass this back to Dee because she does it so eloquently to lead us through community agreements. And we are going to ask you all to please agree to the community agreements in the chat. And if you have any community agreements that you would like to bring forth or uplift, please also write those in the chat as well. Dee?
Thank you. We welcome everyone into this space. And as I shared, as we began, we welcome you as you are. But there are a few boundaries, if you will, and I'm intentionally using the word boundaries and not rules because it just sounds better and it's not as confining. But as a community, we're actually not asking you to agree to them. We are requiring that you agree to them. And as community, we will be required to agree to them as well. And we will be holding ourselves to them. As you saw me do before, sometimes I might even slip up and I might say, you know what, let me dial that back because I'll realize it's not an inherence to the community agreements. For those who may not be familiar with community agreements, they are just simply some boundaries that just by being in this virtual room, just by showing up, you inherently agree to be in this space with us, and you agree to respect and uplift everything that I'm about to say. The granddaddy of all community agreements is just simply respect comes first, and it's not negotiable. A lot of things are going to be said tonight, and we might not all agree with them because we're all coming from so many different areas of the world, and that's okay, but we must respect it. Don't yuck someone else's yum. What might work for me might not work for you, and that's okay too, but please, if you have criticism or something harsh, keep that to yourself because it really just isn't welcome here. Please allow for learning moments. That just simply means please have compassion that we're not all coming to this space with the same understanding. We're not coming to this space with the same knowledge. Please uplift folks that maybe have beginner type questions and aren't where you are in your journey. When we speak, it's really important that we speak from I statements and not from we. Please don't make sweeping generalizations. Please don't come from a place of bias or stereotype or just even assumptions. Intention versus impact. I'm going to take for granted that everyone in this space is coming with good intention, and that perhaps if something is said, it wasn't said with malintent. But it's important that we understand the impact of our words. And when it's said that words have the power of life and death, that means in here too. So while you might not intend to upset someone, please be considerate of what you say because you just might with the words. Listen to receive, not retaliate. That just means no clapbacks. We don't do that here. This is a room of positive energy, love, and education. And really, we are all facilitators in that space. Please listen to what people are actually trying to say and understand that this isn't easy. When people unmute, when they reveal themselves in the chat, that takes courage and bravery. Please don't come from a standpoint that they're coming to offend you or hurt you, because they are not. Please think and reflect beyond borders. We are expanding our conversation beyond a Western-centered view. We have people in this virtual chat coming from all over the world, and they all don't subscribe to a Western-centered view of food, culture, medicine, spirituality, and other. This one, my mentor Tutu taught me when Tutu said, we don't call people out, we call people in. We're a village here. The goal is for all of us to win. It's not necessary to clap back. It's not necessary to call people out and embarrass them. We don't do that. We call each other in so that we can learn and grow together. Shout out in the chat which community agreements speak to you from this list, or ones that you're using effectively in your communications. As I said, this discussion is not going to be easy. We're going to talk about some things that maybe many people have healed through. We're going to talk about some things that maybe many people worked very hard to suppress. We're going to talk about some things that are going to cause many of us to unlearn so we can relearn. Let me see in the chat how these community agreements are speaking and vibing with you. And by all means, please share community agreements in the chat that you think that not only should we add to our list, but that we should be uplifting in our everyday lives. Next slide. I shared that when we started this conversation, it started with the three of us, myself, Chantel, and Tutu. We talked about ancestral foods. We talked about joy, sadness, happiness, and sometimes we talked about these things through tears. We started to name, next slide, please. We started to name all of the different categories and individual foods that have shaped us through our lives, mentally, physically, spiritually, culturally. And then it occurred to us, it dawned on us, we have to talk about what ancestral foods are. And with that, I'm going to pass the mic to Chantel.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, TK. And so in that first iteration, Ancestral Foods, the Story of Food, this was our definition, our working definition of what ancestral foods are, right? And so we really were centering ancestral foods from Africa, from the diaspora, from the Caribbean, and really thinking about indigenous foods, whole foods, like, you know, pick it off the tree, get it out the ground, get it from a bush, find it in the dirt, anything that's whole, that doesn't need a lot of manipulation and is a true food, is what our idea of what a ancestral food was, right? And but then also not only just the food, but also our relationship to it. Like, what's the culture? How is this passed down? Is this a family recipe, right? How are people interacting with this food? One community will say, you know, we burn mugwort, and another community will say we bake it, right? And then another community will say, you know, we dry it out and then we put it in our tea, right? And we make tea with it, right? And so kind of really getting into the meat of what it means to be connected to food and how that ties into our relationship with food and maybe other people's perceptions of food and their perception of our relationship to it.
It's also important to note that as we are talking about ancestral foods, we could have this conversation for hours. This could be its own series. We want to highlight that we are specifically talking about the ancestral foods of the diaspora, stemming from Africa, Central South America, and the Caribbean. We do uplift that many cultures and communities have their own ancestral foods, but tonight we will be discussing those specific regions. We want to remind everyone that, again, these conversations are not easy to have, but they are necessary and we must have them. And we want to continue to uplift. Let us all be kind. As Anne said, we must be kind. And let's understand that the conversation also doesn't end here. We will provide resources and our contact information at the end of this session to keep that conversation growing. When we talked about ancestral food, Chantel, Tutu, and I, we started to just come up with so many things and we started to divide them into categories. We chose to specifically feature for that first ancestral foods conversation, which you can find at GrowNYC on Instagram. And we'll go ahead and include that recording as we send out this recording as well. We decided to specialize on specific foods and beverages that were speaking to our hearts at that time. I was very excited to talk about rice. Chantel was excited to talk about all the things that she was learning about callaloo. And to be transparent, I had first asked Tutu if she would be interested in talking about indigo. And she said, no, we're going to talk about coffee. And I said, okay, because when your mentor speaks, you listen. We remembered these categories, and when we started to talk about what this conversation needed, not should, needed to look like, the aspect of commodities. And when we talked about the global impact of food, global and commodities just kept coming up more and more and more. Next slide. So for tonight, for this roundtable, that we're just going to jump into right now because there's been enough talking from Chantel and I. For tonight, when we talk about the global impact of the diaspora on food and agriculture, we're going to talk about it from the aspect of entrepreneurship, featuring a premier business owner, master chocolatier, and his drive, his passion, and his journey through entrepreneurship and some other aspects that I'm not going to give away because his story isn't for me to tell. But we're going to talk about entrepreneurship. And as we journey together through entrepreneurship, we're also going to be developing, adding to, course correcting, and changing narratives. Y'all, we are all facilitators in this space, and this by all means isn't one of those, just listen. No, shout it out in the chat. Talk amongst yourselves. Corey, our co-moderator, is watching the chat, and he also will be highlighting things that are being said in the chat. And without further ado, there's just nothing more for me to say. Next slide. Robert, take it away.
Thank you for the welcome and all the people that have decided to join us. This is an amazing opportunity. I am so excited to be a part of the Gardens at NYCHA. And again, thank you, DK and Chantel and Tutu and Corey for facilitating this. My name is Robert Bowden. I am the founder of Viveré Chocolates, a chocolatier as well. But I think for the relationship of today's talk, I'm also a product of intergenerational farming. I grew up in the rural South. And so there were so many things that I learned about heirloom practices and all of those things. So that is a little bit about me. I still am very active, both locally and internationally, on the commodity side of cacao as well. And hopefully I'm able to share some things. I will say, if you have questions, please ask. I would love to, as much as I can, answer those. But first, cacao facts. The picture that you're seeing, it comes from a trip that was motivated from a humanitarian aspect and not my business. I had been working for years within the cacao industry, sat on various boards, all of that. And what happened is we had a really interesting question about what's going on in Africa, which I thought was kind of, that's where 80% of the cacao comes from. So we should have a really good thermometer on what's happening there. I sat at a board meeting and asked a very simple question. Who all has been? Who has spoken to the farmers? Who has stepped on the ground, onto the continent? And not a single person raised their hand. I stopped the meeting at that point. I said, you can continue. I've got to go buy a plane ticket. And off to Africa I went. I can't tell you how emotional that was. Because I didn't anticipate it to be. I thought it was pretty cut and dry. Go get some information and come back. No. What I did learn is that in cacao, and we're going to look at some cacao facts, there are around 5 million cacao farmers around the world. 2 million, roughly 2.5 million of those on the African continent. And chocolate is clearly, I want to define what is considered cacao. And the technical name is Theobroma cacao. And that's for the plant that produces cocoa. Now, in all of that, you have some really unique things as it pertains to farming. And what is unique about cacao in relationships to the diaspora is this. We do not, as a culture, utilize cacao in its processed form. As an African culture, we utilize it in its fruit form, which is interesting because most people that eat cacao or eat chocolate have no idea that it's a fruit. It's in that we have a situation of disconnect, misunderstanding, and you'll see the cacao/cocoa industry is $120 billion industry. Yes, it is. It is but that is for all of these stages once it's left the farm. And that's with any commodity, but unlike most cash crops, cacao does not respond well to mass farming practices. They've tried for hundreds of years and it still doesn't. And so those types of factors lead to why it creates such an interesting juggernaut, because it's very labor intensive. Is this someone speaking?
No, please continue.
Okay. Then with that, you have a set of, I think the biggest concern for me in the farming practices was there was a general understanding or general assumption happening stateside that, oh, we need to teach them how to farm. And that was bothering me. That was bothering me a lot because it just kept coming, oh, well, the reason we're having issues is we need to show them better farming practices. When I got to Africa, this is what I knew. You don't have to farm in that fashion at all. The environment is such, the climate is such, that the things you need to sustain the people there happen. And the only time you need what I would call Western farming practices is for excess. And excess always leads to trouble when there is no direct relation back to source. So for me, watching the diaspora, and chocolate was not, we talk about it starting in Central America, but if you're looking at the diaspora, it circles right back and is mostly produced in the African continent because there's more space, there's a better climate, the land in itself lends to the natural growth of cacao. You don't have that in Central America. You have, or not enough space. We often talk about the commodities. We don't talk about the people moving the commodities in the context of the people that are able to grow it, the people who are able to keep it sustainable. Because again, you're coming across the ocean. There was a lot that didn't make the journey. And so we found products that were able to do so. So what I would like to talk about, next slide. With fun facts. So cocoa was money. And that was one of the first things that was noticed in the expansion and colonization, was that chocolate as we know it now did not exist, and didn't exist for a long time. Chocolate was basically the seeds. And so to give you a breakdown, what you're looking at now is the inside of a cacao pod. in a cacao pod. It's about the size of a small football, and it has about 40 to 50 seeds. Those seeds are covered in pulp. The pulp on those seeds is what allows it to ferment when you dry it. And then once that's dried and ground, it's the seeds that we grow or make chocolate from, nothing else. That fruit is very tasty, almost citrusy. That's the best example that I had while I was having it there. Eating cacao off the tree is an experience I can't explain. And it's just a very fruity. It doesn't smell like chocolate. It doesn't look like chocolate. It's great. All the colors, red, yellow, brown, orange. You crack open the pod and you can just sit there and just eat the fruit. And that, from a people of the African diaspora, that is our exposure to cacao. The beans are discarded. Some grow into new trees, but for the most part, they're discarded. The process of making cacao on that side of the world is purely what occurs there or for export. Because there are two things that I want us to know as we continue this journey, is that the average cocoa farmer has never tasted chocolate, ever. And for those that would desire to, they can't afford it. Those two things trouble me very greatly. And that's also part of what I learned from my visit, was that this is of no interest to them. This was put upon them. And in the only way that this is sustained is that we've created a monoculture. And anybody in farming knows that monoculture does not work in nature. You can't keep it. You reuse the same land over and over. You're ripping nutrients out of the ground. There's only so much that it can take. Also, it's so labor intensive that no one, and honestly, I want to point out that chocolate, we talk about tempering. If you hear in the food space, tempered chocolate and so on and so forth. Let's just be real. Chocolate is temperamental. Temperamental. Chocolate does not care, or cocoa doesn't care that you want to grow a lot of it. It needs to be in a rainforest. It needs to be under the canopy of trees. It is not pollinated by bees. It is not in any of the things that we commonly think of. You can't force it. It has to sort of happen. And that in and of itself is proof of how the African continent provides. Because it really is an interest, you can't. For the economics of, and speaking of the global landscape, this is why it was easy to take something that is technically discarded by the native population and capitalized on, and then cultivated to such a degree that it loses sight. Because I think we should know what cacao looks like. We should know that, yeah, I can have a cacao pod and eat this without all of the additives and still enjoy cacao. If you notice on the slide, you'll see that Ivory Coast, single largest producer, right at about 60, between Ivory Coast and Ghana, you're looking at 70+% of all cacao in the world, all of it. And if you look at how that's managed, that's grown by those same 2.5 million farmers. And I'm sure anyone familiar with what's going on with the narratives around the cacao industry, we use some terms that are used. Next slide, please. We use some cacao versus cacao. If you read any general article, they'll tell you we can use those interchangeably. And I'm like, no, you can't. Now, by definition, cacao, being unprocessed, is the base form. In cocoa, you're looking at a refined, a derivative, if you will, because it has had all of the nutrients removed. It has been ground, including the cocoa butter. That's why it now becomes a cocoa cake or a paste looking, and then it's crushed. So you end up with cocoa powder. For cocoa powder to be of any value to you, so many things have to be added back in. This is the economics of how chocolate, dark chocolate is good for you, but milk chocolate is not. That is because dark chocolate generally has most of its natural things at a certain percentage, I would say right around 72% or higher, has a lot of the things that would have normally been stripped out, they're still there. But the reason I want to talk about the difference in cacao versus cocoa is in the legalities of trade and what allows the movement. So, fact to note, it is illegal for people on the African continent to sell wholly finished products anywhere outside of Africa. And that I couldn't figure that for a minute. And I was talking to one of my suppliers because immediately I assumed, fine, yes. And that goes in, they can sell the raw commodity. They can sell the unfinished bean, whether it be just dried. But as far as finished good, no. Chocolate as we know it, even if you are in Africa, unless you're growing it yourself, it becomes a real interesting language issue. You'll start seeing things like sugar embargoes, and all of those things are directly related to the level of product. And the reason that's important is because if all you can remove or sell officially is the commodity, that is the lowest price point you will ever see chocolate. That's because it's an unusable bean. So something else, since I see this, I'm able to see the questions that pop up. There is a opportunity to discuss how the colonization of places happen, and that's another subject for another day and another time. But if you look at the colonial governments that are still they're in action there, are bound by those colonizing places to then, it's written into their law that they have to supply their product to. And I had heard that, but it wasn't until I went that I was made very aware of the fear that I was coming to buy up product. And I said, no, I was just coming to ask questions. And the farmers, I actually met with one of the co-op leaders. So she was the head of 1,500 cocoa farmers. She wanted to talk to me. She says, but people are a little concerned because we're not allowed to sell you anything. I said, you never met me before. You're not allowed to sell me anything. And I said, why? Well, if by any chance we sell to a single other person, the largest contract or the governing contract of our provider will basically stall us out and not purchase. So now you have a whole entire economy gone. That was a very hard thing for me to process. But staying on task with what I learned about farming, I was able to switch I started asking the questions. What I learned quickly was that they would rather do other things. They were interested in farming other crops. They were interested in providing for their families. They were interested in cultivating the things that they knew, but were not allowed to. And when I say that, I want it to be truly understood that in 2024, we still have vast places in our economic system around the world that require slave labor. Now, I don't want the slave labor to get murky because the significance of those 2.5 million farmers and the unique qualities of cacao, unlike most cash crops, is that you don't see a single large player in the space, all of your grain companies, and who shall remain nameless, don't own cocoa farms because it is not profitable. It is not. It isn't. So we use incendiary language like plantations. If I say plantations, everybody on this call has an opinion. But in actuality, they're farms. They're just small farms with families. We were talking about Ivory Coast. the population of the Ivory Coast, 60% of its entire population is under 25. 37% is under the age of 14. The average family is a family of 4 to a family of 5 by the age of 19. Of course, there's going to be child labor. Half of the country, by Western standards, are considered children. So this is more nuanced than, oh, we should boycott, because for the last several hundred years, the population has been destabilized because they're expected to produce cacao so that I can load up on a barge and leave the country. And that's been going on. It's one of the few pre-colonial institutions that is still operating just as it did through colonization. And it is based on the sheer size, it is almost impossible to chocolate has not changed in how it's made. Even if you look in the factories, even if you look at the machinery, it is the exact same. Open up a huge, it's 2 stones rubbing against the other on top of a third. That's what's inside of the machines. That's what's happening on the ground at origin. It doesn't change. So you can't, there's not been a way, it is a very unique product. But I think watching that travel from Africa, this is why it was on the move, it was not utilized there. And before I left, I thought I ended up talking more about raising animals and other crops that they could support their family, because that was what they wanted to know. And the most fascinating thing, and I don't know if it was fascinating or heartbreaking, was in that day, I was there, I spent a month. I literally I immersed myself in the culture. I was in the rainforest. I met with over 500 farmers, and the objective was to hear. And I couldn't believe that they all showed up. And they said, well, if you're willing to come 10,000 miles, we can come down the road. And to talk to farmers, where I was the first chocolatier and finished product person to ever speak to them for a product that they produce every single day, was unfathomable. Next slide. Okay, back. So we're here. So with that, watching it travel, we can go back. Watching that travel from the West up to Europe and then back down to Africa, we watch this triangle, and we're pulling the things that you'll hear about. We often talk about coffee and sugar and rum as they move around. And the reason you don't hear them as often in the complete triangle is because chocolate is of no value once it gets back to Africa. They can't buy it. That is watching how the break, until the fact that, unless, again, if the loop can't complete, you're going to have backup and you're going to have scarcity. If the chocolate industry collapses, what do we have to replace it? We think of it as a tradition. But it's more of a practice with limited alternatives. So always be mindful of that when we talk about things that we enjoy and watch. And how it is now and how it was then is not the same for a lot of commodities, but chocolate hasn't changed.
Thank you so much for that, Robert. That was riveting. And I am on the edge of my seat to see what questions people have for you at the end. We're going to move to our next commodity, and I'm going to ask Tutu to talk us through tea and the relationship between tea, cacao, cocoa, commodities, and how all of these things are interconnected.
Great. Thank you, Chantel. Hello, everyone. My name is Tutu Badaru. I'm the Assistant Director for GrowNYC's Food Access Initiatives. And this I feel like with these two conversations, we've been talking about things that are near and dear to my heart, but most especially, we're talking about foods, we're talking about plants that are indigenous to the spaces that I come from, to the place that I come from in Eastern Africa, but that was stolen, whose stories were stolen, and many people aren't able to connect these two items, both coffee and tea, to its original spaces. Before I start, I want to encourage you all to answer a couple of questions. What's the first thing that comes to mind when you think or hear about tea? And what are your own connections to tea? I'll give us a couple of minutes to think through that and answer that. What's the first thing that comes to mind when you hear or think about tea? And what are your own connections to tea? Thanks, Em. India, healing herbs. Yeah, I love that.
I would like to shout out and uplift. What are your connections to
Calming.
tea? And tell us, what kinds of tea do you enjoy? I am a caffeine-free person. Chantel actually likes something with a little more kick. Shout out, let's uplift, let's share with the community. What kinds of teas are you enjoying and what would you recommend? Tutu?
Yeah. And I can share that I love that, Ruth, your mother. When I think of tea, I think of number one, tea is something that we drank 3 to 4 times a day. I think of coming back home, coming back to the space that is familiar, the space where there's food, it's warming, it's comforting. The tea I grew up drinking either had lemongrass or it had ginger or it had spices. It wasn't like this bland tea that people keep serving us is very foreign to me. Our tea always had spices. And there are a couple of really beautiful stories. Thank you so much. Some folks think of the earth. A lot of folks think of herbal English breakfast. But one thing you might actually hear once you think of tea, especially in this country, a lot of people connect tea to Britain. They connect it to the UK. They think of the Queen. They think of teapots. They think of Downton Abbey. That's what people think about when they hear tea, right? And many might be surprised to know that tea is actually from China. It's an indigenous bush that bush tree that has grown in China for millennia and was being chewed and cooked. Some folks would use it in medicinal tinctures and mixtures. Folks were eating it dried or even raw. Some folks were putting in their food, putting in its soups. And so it's always existed. It's a shrub that grew naturally. And the tea that I'm talking about, the commodity that we're talking about, is its Greek name is Camelina sinensis. And the idea of tea, according to Chinese legend, came from an emperor who was sitting under a tree, and his servant was boiling water, and a couple of dried leaves happened to fall into the water. And it infused, and he tried it and was like, oh, this tastes really good, right? And so, they started to experiment. They started to make, dried versions of it. And we're going to talk a little bit about the two different kinds of tea and how we get that. But, archaeologists found lots of containers of tea, different types, in tombs that were dating back from the Han Dynasty. The Tang Dynasty is the time when tea drinking became very popular in China. And at this same time, there's a lot of Chinese monks who are traveling in and out of China and got exposed to tea drinking. And that sort of caught on. And so they took the tea seeds, the tea plants back to Japan. And you also learn there's a deep history of Japan and tea ceremonies and matcha. And lots of people are now very familiar with matcha. That's basically just dried and ground tea powder. And that's actually originally where it started. Another group of people who caught on to tea and its deliciousness and its benefits and its medicinal purposes were the Portuguese, right? And the Portuguese are always the people who started everything, right? So the Portuguese caught on to it. They tried some tea and they're like, oh, this is really good. What can we do? How can we make money from it, right? So they started to export tea from China. And I started to talk about the different kinds of tea. So you'll find in Chinese communities and in Japanese communities, there's a preference for green tea. And the difference is that green tea is harvested and withered, and then they prevent it from oxidizing. In Chinese communities, they do this by pan frying, and in Japanese communities, this is done by steaming. So this process is intended to halt the oxidation so that the leaves can retain the green color, the fresh and delicate flavor that you get from green tea. Whereas you find in European communities, specifically the Portuguese, they were very familiar with coffee drinking, another commodity that was stolen from Africa, but they're very familiar with this flavor, and so they preferred the black tea. And so black tea, same thing, you harvest the leaves, you dry them, and then you allow them to oxidize, and that's what gives it its smoky, tobacco-like, really strong flavor. And so initially, during pre-colonial times, all the tea, any tea that was being drunk was only coming from China. And I'll tell you another quick story about a different type of tea. But all the tea that was being drunk across the world was coming from China. And, a lot of people are upset about that, because then the Chinese government then determined the price of tea. And you had all of these Western governments not wanting to be indebted to Chinese communities, right? They wanted to be able to benefit from that. So there's a really interesting story about how tea eventually ended up in the British colonies. The British government assigned, so actually I'll take a step back. How did the British people get so in love with tea? One of the princesses who married, I think it's Charles IV, his princess was from Portugal. She loved tea, brought that habit of drinking tea to the court. And because tea was being exported, it was very wealthy. It was very elitist. Poor people weren't drinking tea, they're drinking coffee, or they were drinking watered down versions of tea that they were getting from richer people who were drinking it. So it was very common for people to take used tea back home if they were servants, and that's what they would serve to their families. So you have very rich people in Britain and in the UK and thinking, we need tea, we don't want to pay too much money for it, and we don't exactly want that money to go to the Chinese government. And there's also some mixture. The whole tea and China story is very sad and very heartbreaking. There's some opium mixed in. At some point, the British government was buying it for money, and at some point they exchanged it for opium, and very sad. But eventually Britain was they wanted to be the ones benefiting from that. So they assigned a botanist, and they told him to impersonate a Chinese tea grower. And so he was living incognito and working on a tea plantation. And so he learned about how to grow tea. And then he ended up stealing both seeds and plants and exporting them to colonial spaces, because again, you can't grow tea in Britain, even though people always think about tea in Britain. It doesn't have the conducive climate for growing tea. Tea needs warm tropical climate in order to grow. And so they exported the seeds and started to grow them in their colonies. And that's the tea that you now find in England. Next slide. So what about tea in Africa? And before I dig into Africa, I do want to tell another story about, so you see in that picture, the topmost picture, that's the tea plant. It's an artistic description of what the tea plant looks like. And there are different kinds of tea from across the world, but mostly tea is indigenous to China, to India, and to Thailand. In China, it's the Greek name I told you, Camelina sinensis. In India, you might be familiar with Assam tea that comes from the Assam region in India, and then Ceylon tea is from China. And again, tea requires warm tropical climates, and this is why it's indigenous and native to these spaces. So initially, the British started to steal Chinese tea to grow it in India. It didn't work out because the climates are different. But then, they discovered that the folks in Assam were already drinking, eating. They already knew about tea. They knew about its properties. And so they started to then grow more of that. And then the Assam tea that was grown in India was the tea that's now being exported to places like East Africa, which is where I come from. Kenya is one of the largest growing spaces for tea. And something I forgot to say, that tea is the second most common drank beverage in the world, only second to water. I know here in the US, we're very familiar with coffee. We love coffee, but tea across the world is a very popular drink. Right. So Um, and as I mentioned, you know, in Assam, in India, people are using tea for its medicinal purposes. They're adding it to things like soup. They were drinking it when it's ill, when they were ill, and when they had stomach problems. And what about tea in Africa? So there are different origins of tea depending on what part of Africa you're thinking of. If you're thinking of Northern Africa, in Morocco, a lot of the tea came from influences from Japanese monks and Chinese monks. And so that's a lot of green tea. There's a lot of ceremony around it. And when you're thinking of Kenya, you remember I told you the story that the tea was stolen from China. They tried to grow it in India. It didn't work. They realized that the Assam tea was much better in this climate. And then they started to grow it in Kenya because while Kenya has a tropical climate, it's also really cool and it was much easier for white people to live there because the climate is not as harsh as it is in India. And yeah, so up to date, you can find a lot of tea plantations, both in Eastern Africa. There's lots of tea plantations in Uganda, where I come from. And I did want to highlight one type of tea that's specifically indigenous to Africa, and this is in Southern Africa. Folks might be familiar with a tea called rooibos. And rooibos is a red tea. When you infuse it into water, it turns red. And rooibos is actually like the Dutch word or the Afrikaans word for red bush. And that's because it's a red bush that grows in the Capetonian Mountains. It's the only place where you can grow it successfully. And rooibos has lots of antioxidants. It's very good for, there's a lot of research that's been done about how beneficial it is for both preventing cancer, preventing heart disease, and that's something that was already known by the people who are living there, by the Khoisan, by the Khoikhoi, who were using this way before the colonists came. And then lastly, you know, we've talked about tea, the commodity, but similar to our conversation that we had, we were talking about coffee. Actually, let's go to the coffee slide and then I'll come back and end with the tea slide. Thank you. The last time we had this conversation, we were talking about how coffee is not just the instant experience that we have, that in Africa, you know, coffee and tea have this community aspect towards it. And there's this whole ritual and this beauty around it. And you can see here in this picture the different steps of an Ethiopian woman, an Eritrean woman preparing preparing coffee, not just for herself, but for her entire community. And it starts from the time when they're roasting the beans themselves, and that's calling to people, telling them something's happening. We're making coffee, we're making it for everyone, come and share, come and join in. And there's just this like beautiful all over this drink, this bean that connects us to our ancestors that we've sort of lost with like the instant idea of you know, grinding coffee in our kitchens. And so similar, if you go back the slide before, Chantel. Thank you. Similarly, in Western Africa, specifically in the Senegalese community, there is a ceremony around tea, and it is connected and it simplifies all the various stages of life. So when they're serving tea, they're usually preparing it for a large group of people, a large community. And so they steep the tea in hot water. And the first round of tea is very strong. And the intent is to savor the flavor. The intent is to connect you as the person who's drinking and the people around, to remind you about the different stages of life. So that first stage that's like very bitter, it represents the beginnings of life, like the harsh pains of growing up and getting used to like being on this earth and being connected. And then the second round, they add more water and they steep it again. And also they add a little bit of mint and they add some sugar to it. And that's intended to symbolize like the midlife, you know, you're here, you're settled, you're connected, everything's great. You're enjoying love and marriage. And then finally, there's a third round, you know, and you've had the same tea leaves that have been steeping in water. So it's not as strong as the first or the second. And so it's the weak, it's a weaker flavor. And this represents your old age. As you're, you know, slowly, you've been settled for a while and you're slowly sort of like moving on to the next part of your life. So it's been, you know, it's fascinating to see how these two commodities that were so important for the community that come from, and to see that these, how these are connected to one another, and the stories that have been, washed over in, in preference for just like capitalism and money. And I think that's it. That's my slide. And I think we have lots of I was able to add a really great video that shows you the whole tea making process and the tea ceremony that really describes how connected it is to our spirituality and our ancestors.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Tutu. That was absolutely amazing. And I'm sure the chat is blowing up. So people are so excited to hear about these tea ceremonies, and just the reverence and the importance and the stories. The story was so amazing and impactful. And so now I want to pass it back to Robert to talk to us a little bit about cotton. And this is going to be spicy, so I'm excited for the chat.
Robert, unmute for us, please.
Can you hear me now? There we go. Cotton. Cotton is an interesting subject, especially as we talk about farming and things that happen through that diaspora. And so with cotton, it is often, I listen at the arguments of the North and the South. Cotton is what allowed the United States to gain the global position that it is. That's why it's here. And before I get into that, I want to take it back to Africa, is that we forget that cotton isn't new. America clearly didn't invent it. So where was it being cultivated before? Where was the cotton happening that was being utilized around the world? And it was Africa. And so I started out with this particular slide because we are at GrowNYC. We are talking about this as it pertains to Black community, the diaspora. And in particular, I wanted it noted that we talk about New York being a financial powerhouse. That's because of cotton. That is also the impetus of why the country had to be united. That was the objective of the Civil War. We were about to lose not so much just the fact that we were the global producer of cotton by then, was the fact that the financiers that we hear about, the shipping magnates, all of those things, what were they shipping? Cotton. And therefore, they were providing insurance and financing all of those things to the South. In the slide, you'll see that even in that moment, it was generating $200 million. In the 1860s, it was generating $200 million just for New York. Just for New York. That's not what it was getting everywhere else. And the equivalent of that is $7.4 billion. And so it became quite imperative that both we keep the country together and we keep producing cotton. And so speaking of the diaspora, they didn't just take crops, they brought the people who knew how to grow them. They brought the knowledge that those cultures were utilizing to cultivate and produce cotton goods and fabrics. These were things thought, and we're talking about, this is like, it stems so much farther. I don't want our dialogue to always talk about what happens in the middle of colonization, but looking at who we were before, as Tutu mentioned, there was so much booming about how we produce things. And so to me, watching that, in particular, how it tied to the South and where we were being deposited throughout the diaspora, cotton is a thing that, next slide, please. You have 3000 BC. So the Romans and the Greeks They loved the fabrics. Where were they getting it? Africa. I don't think I ever learned about that. And that was never, we never talked about the fact that the first plantation producing cotton, and I do want us to, I bring that word up again, understanding how it strikes your ear. It's a farm. And therefore, that was happening. The first cultivated cotton farm was in Africa. That was the significance of bringing, if we're going to, and tying back to Britain and tea, while Britain didn't want to be beholden to China, the US knew that Britain's and the powerhouse of fabric and textiles was heavily reliant on getting their product from Africa. So not only did they take the product, they took the people that produced the product. And now, in this back and forth going on between the colonies and Europe, was, oh, well, we have now your fabric. So it would be very limited fashion going on if you can't get this fabric from us. And that was why when tea didn't work, and we could only, the US is not really conducive to a lot of other things growth-wise. We've got corn. Cotton was what they leaned into. And if you look at the list, it'll talk about the Romans and us cultivating along the Nile. This is going to be the invention of the cotton gin, the Civil War, the reorganization of the United States. All of those things hinge right at the same epicenter. And it was, how do we keep control of these commodities that are not native to where they've expanded? And while they're busy figuring how to manipulate that, what was keeping everything going were the indigenous people and the Africans that have been brought here to do so. I think we have one more. Is that one more slide? Shouldn't be. So knowing that, for us, with the map that we have, you can kind of see, I think we often talk about the commodity side. I want to talk about the people side. I'm just the people person. And I look at what happens is that we're moving people. It says they moved the enslaved people. They were moving artisans. They're moving farmers, cultivators, knowledgeable people, because that wasn't happening. To get those raw materials out of the colonies and back to Europe, I want it to be noted that it blanketly says manufactured goods. The only thing being shipped from Europe to Africa was guns and uniforms. You have people going to the colonies, raw materials, the sugar, the rum, all of these things that we're producing, and then cotton going to Europe. And then what was coming out of Europe was uniforms and ammunition. But I want it noted that we were always producers and always cultivators, no matter where we've been.
Thank you so much for that, Robert. And now we're going to get into the last part of our roundtable talk, where we start to talk about, what does all this mean, right? How are we continuing to reshape our food narratives? How are we continuing to learn more about food and understand our relationship to it? Why we have these very specific relationships to it? Why we have these ideas, right? Robert, Tutu blew my mind talking about chocolate, talking about tea, talking about coffee, talking about these ceremonies, but then also talking about a very real narrative that definitely does shape my relationship with all of these different foods. And so I want to talk a little bit about that right now. And
As
so
we transition, just one moment, please, just one moment. I need to acknowledge that let's do a temperature check. Let's do a temperature check. Everybody, please stay hydrated. Everybody, please focus on your breath work. Everybody, please stretch. Everybody, please turn off your camera if you are called to do so. It is not lost on us. The severity, the emotional, spiritual, cultural aspects of this conversation. I will uplift again that these conversations are not easy to have, but we must have them. I want to uplift everyone who has done healing work or maybe is on your healing journey right now to understand that it's never the land's fault and that how our relationship may have started isn't our whole story. We understand that many who have perhaps suppressed memories or are struggling with this healing, we receive you and we thank you for being in this space. It would be irresponsible of myself, Chantel, Robert, Tutu, and Corey to not extend our hand to continue the conversation. So as we provide resources, we also provide our contact information at the end of this presentation. And it is an open invite to please discuss with us some of the challenges that you might be having unpacking this. So I just want to uplift everybody just before we dive into defining relationships. Let's just take, please, 10 seconds. Everybody just take a moment. Let's drop our shoulders. Let's chill for like 10 seconds. And then Chantel is going to lead us back to defining relationships with food.
That was amazing. Thank you for that recentering, that grounding, DK. I think it was so needed. Just so needed, so very necessary. And so this is this definition, these different categories, right? We came up with this in our first ancestral foods conversation. And DK, myself, Tutu, we talked about, what are the different things that impact our relationships with food? And so we came up with self, environment, culture, and community. And obviously there are probably a million more, right, categories that define our relationship with food. If you can think of any, please drop them in the chat. And we will uplift that for the next iteration of Ancestral Foods, because I do feel we will continue having these conversations and continue sharing these food stories because they are so important and so very, very impactful. And so so like how you identify, how do you show up, right? What are your markers? What are the things that make you uniquely you, right? And also like, how do you feel about yourself? How you feel about you impacts how you feel about foods or how you feel about ingesting certain things, right? Your palate, what you grew up eating, right? Then we get into environment, right? So where you're born definitely impacts your relationship with food, and it impacts how you taste things. Do you like bitters? Do you like sweets? Do you like savory? Do you eat rice in the morning, right? That's connected to your environment, right? And so then we start talking about culture, right? And so culture for me, like my mom is like, when I get up in the morning, I'm eating grits, right? Because that's our culture. It's easy to make, it's quick, 5 minutes, you out the door, put some butter, put some cheese, get out, right? And so that was my relationship with grits because of my culture, because my family is from the South. And so it's all about the hearty, it's all about the savory, right? It's all about, Chantel, you need to put some weight on, right? And so these conversations were happening and kind of shaping my own idea, my own relationship with food, right? And then talking about community, right? And church is one of the first things I put up there because that was my first relationship to what a big meal looks like. We would be in church and we would have first services in the morning, and then after that you get a break and we all sit down and we eat together, and then we're second service, right? And so these things were definitely impacting what I thought about food, what it looked like to share food, what it looked like to be in community with people in relationship with food, right? And like I said, there are so many different markers and so many different things that define and hone our relationships with food. And I want to give a second. DK, do you want to talk about this a little bit?
I do. I want to uplift that these are the categories that Chantel, Tutu, and I, again, when we were having these conversations almost 2 years ago, these were the categories that came up for us. And just today, someone shared with me before we joined this workshop experience that in the environment category, access and economics continue to play a strong part of their relationship with food. And that hit me very differently. It reminded me of Chantel and I's purpose with Gardens at NYCHA, that food is a right, not a privilege, that food security is achievable when we grow together, when we consider each other's needs as well as our own. It also reminds me, all of these categories, that my relationship with food really causes me to understand my relationship with myself, my relationship with my upbringing, my continued journey. And relationships with food, for me, food is my friend. Food is my comforter. Food is also my guide. It's my educator. I could go on and on. And it's important to know that as we talk about these things, more might come up for you as we keep saying the conversation doesn't end here.
And so I wanted to put this into context, right? I talked a little bit about the grits and rice and church meals, right? But I wanted to bring like a very concrete example of how narrative and propaganda and stories have played a very real role in my relationship with food. And I'll use watermelon as an example. And so on the screen, I'm talking a little bit about the propaganda that went into shaming Black people for growing and selling watermelon. And when I say propaganda, I do mean like a very onslaught of programming, right? So we have media with images, we have minstrelsy, which is the theater, the production that is put on, right? We also have people saying like, oh, you know, the way you eat a watermelon is messy. And so therefore, people who eat watermelon are messy or uncultured, right? And so there was a lot of propaganda that went into talking about watermelon and the selling of watermelon because entrepreneurship was tied to it. So there was economics, and then there was propaganda, which led to a lack of economics. And that's the game, right? And so when people were freed and they were like, okay, we know our culture, we know how to grow stuff. We've been doing this, right? This is in our DNA. We're going to grow watermelon because watermelon is easy to grow in the South. Also, watermelon is big enough to share with a whole family. So you can actually like get full off of watermelon, right? Also, watermelon is a hydrator. It's 90% water, right? And so now when we have the hot beaming sun on your back, on your neck, what do you want? You want a big, juicy piece of fruit that has all the water, all the nutrients, everything that you need, and you want enough to share with your whole family. And so there were very concrete reasons why people were growing watermelon. And there was also very concrete reasons why there was propaganda against people growing and selling watermelon. And so this narrative impacted me. So when I'm growing up in Brooklyn and people are like, oh yeah, all Black people do is eat watermelon, that impacted me to the point where I said, I'm not going to eat watermelon because I don't want you to try to shame me. I don't want you to use my food choices against me, right? And so later on in life, learning this story and learning about the entrepreneurship and learning about the imagery that was purposely created and the narrative that was purposely created around Black people and our relationship to watermelon, it freed me. It freed me from that bondage of feeling like, oh, people are going to judge me for eating watermelon. And I know that that is very, very specific and is very specific for a reason, right? And so I'm just saying that because sometimes we don't think that stories hold weight, but we know. What is the famous quote, right? The pen is mightier than the sword. And that pen was striking. And it definitely did co-opt my relationship and maybe other people's relationship to watermelon and to other foods.
It's important that when we share our stories, that we don't rewrite narratives. We write narratives. We don't cross out what has been written about us, not in our voice. We write it from our voice. And the story share of the impact of watermelon on Chantel's life and my life and many other lives is but one example of how we must reclaim our language. At Gardens at NYCHA, we don't work in the ghetto. Our residents don't live in the projects. For us, they live in communities. And we are brilliant. We are artists. We are growers. We are chefs. We are everything that the world tells us we can't be. When we reclaim the agency of what watermelon truly meant and did for us, we use our voice, we tell our stories, and we create our own legacy. I want to acknowledge that we're at the 7:21 mark, and we do want to respect everyone's time. Next slide, please. As we draw to as we draw to our end, to the conclusion of this experience, and it was definitely an experience for me versus a workshop. We want to encourage everyone to think of these prompts about how this experience perhaps has reframed and reshaped your relationship with food. We remind you that it's okay to unlearn so you can relearn. We encourage you to stand in what your truth is, even if that means making the decision to change your mind. This recording will be sent to everyone so that you can take a longer snapshot of this. But these were just some prompts that came up for us as we were building this experience, how our relationships, for some, began, how they transitioned, or maybe how they stayed the same. Next slide. We have 2 slides of resources. It's okay. We have 2 slides of resources that we would like to empower everyone to use to help continue that conversation. And again, we do offer our contact information for everyone to reach out to us, share your stories, share your impact, share what you are doing to uplift the conversation of the diaspora in your communities. We want to leave this last 7 minutes for everyone. If you are inclined, feel free to please raise your hand and we would be happy to unmute you or have you come off mute. Corey is also watching the chat, as am I. For those who maybe don't feel called to unmute, but you do still want to use the platform, please go ahead and shout out in the chat. We will get to as many questions as possible, but if you just feel called to verbally speak in this space, please raise your hands and we are more than happy to unmute as time allows. As you are thinking about if you do want to raise your hand, if you do want to shout something out in the chat, I really must take this time to thank Tutu and Chantel, of whom, when I wasn't always able to articulate this vision of ancestral foods, had an unspoken herd with me that they could feel what was in my heart, and they were able to encourage and guide me on how to uplift this conversation. I want to thank Robert for joining this conversation, and you just amaze me just to be in your presence of what you know and how you share it, your willingness to not be afraid and to use your voice is just an honor for me. I want to shout out Corey, who has been keeping an eye on the chat, and from the side, been executive producing this whole thing. Shout out to Corey. Thank you so much. And I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge GrowNYC for believing in Chantel and I in Gardens at NYCHA and saying, you know what, this is the right thing to do. And we are passing the mic to community. Thank you for all the people that I'm not able to mention, but are still tirelessly working on those great and amazing social media posts, internal and external communications, and helping us to uplift not only the 2 in-person events that we will have to close out this month, but everything that we will be doing in the season. Chantel, do we see any hands raised?
I'm gonna defer to Corey. Corey, yep, there we go.
Yes. I would first just like to start by, as usual, thanking everyone here in attendance, starting with Chantel, DK, Tutu, Robert. Thank you so much for, bringing us together, asking me to be a part of it. Thank you for having me as a part of this within this space. And thank you for all of the education on so many different levels. I'd like to first uplift some of the things that I've seen within the chat. First of all, the community agreements resonated with a lot of our members here on the on this experience, joining this experience with us today. And not only that, lots of experience were shared, personal experiences. Chantel, me and a lot of other people resonated with you sharing your story and your relationship with watermelon and how that affected you living in New York City. So thank you to everyone for those wonderful experiences. I understand that we have about 3 minutes left, but I definitely do want to again encourage any of the facilitators in the chat who have shared those stories or maybe just want to unmute themselves and just share some emotion, it's okay to just share that emotion. Doesn't have to be planned. We are truly grateful for you all for being here, and we're looking forward to having you attend the next event. And yeah, thank you. Would anyone like to unmute and maybe share some comments?
I think I see Mubarak. Are you raising your hand?
Yes, I'm trying to raise my hand.
Oh, there you go.
Again. How y'all doing, everyone? My name is Mubarak. I'm here on 2 behalves. I'm here on behalf of myself, and I'm here on behalf of my organization, SOS, Neighbors in Action, Save Our Streets. We're an anti-gun violence organization, and I work with a lot of youth. Really, my reason for joining this meeting because first, I'm big on food. I'm big on my family is from Tanzania, Africa, and Sudan. So we big on like natural remedies and stuff like that. You know what I mean? So having this community to speak about these things and the history. Like I'm young. I'm not young. I'm 29, but but I'm the youngest in my family who's plant-based and on the verge of eating and trying to change the norms that's in my family. And I remember growing up, the story Chantel, I think she was speaking about watermelons, and I remember growing up with so much watermelon, seeded watermelons and seeded grapes and all these things. And I remember taking this journey on veganism or plant-based and trying to find good fruits. And I noticed that I lived in a food desert. I never even looked at, understood what the terms or anything these things was. But I feel like we need to really take back the ownership of growing or learning how to grow. This is important, especially for myself. It's so much me buying so much stuff, just trying to figure out organic food, organic fruit and vegetables, right? But I really believe in teaching or having a community that encourage the growth of your own food. And you know what I mean? That's very needed, especially in our communities. where it's not a norm anymore. And when we was growing up, it was so much of a norm to have fruit in your house and know how to plant a plant or whatever the case is like. And I feel like that's really dying out. And I appreciate everyone on this call for bringing this back together. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that share. Renee, we see your hands. Please unmute. Going once, going twice.
All right, I'm right up in here. Hello, hello, hello. Let me start this video. Sorry. I just want to say thank you. I am a New Yorker that lives in Maryland, and I've been growing for decades when I lived there. So this is more than sweet to be a part of, to participate, to have all of the touches. And I just wanted to say thank you formally. You know, it's one thing for us to say thank you behind the curtain, but the experiences we have, ancestral growing is something that you do, and you do it with fun and with flair. There's very few Black seed companies. So I'm growing for one of them. And I would be remiss if I'm not going to send you guys some seeds to NYCHA so you could get some things going out there. I come to New York often, as my mom still lives there. And I just wanted to say thank you, thank you, thank you. So that's it for me. I have your contact information. I thank you for putting it on, and continue your work. Continue.
My apologies. Thank you so much for sharing, Renee. But people would like to know the name of the company
Yes,
that you're a part of, and I just wanted to uplift that.
I'm so sorry. I'm talking and I didn't share the name. The name of the company is Ujamaa Seeds. UJAMAA. They're based here in Maryland, and you can find all types of seeds that, as people of color, indigenous people have bought here. And I just wanted to share that, because doing work in one aspect is one thing, but being able to support people that are doing things to bring seeds back to us that were hidden in our hair coming to this country, that were hidden in our clothing. And if you know the story, it's very different. So I'm sorry, I should have said that. My apologies.
Shout out to Renee.
We share everything. We share everything.
Shout out to Renee and Ujamaa Seeds. Renee, please make sure you email us at gardens@NYCHA@GrowNYC.org so that we may uplift this. We want to respect everyone's time, but I do see Jay's hand raised. Jay, we're going to have you close us out with the final question. Chantel, if you can slide to our contact slides for those who still have questions, impact statements, please, please, please. It's an open invite. If we hear from you next week, if we hear from you a year from now, please shout it out. Jay is going to close us out. This recording will be emailed to all who registered. The conversation doesn't stop here. I pass the mic to Jay. Thank you for all who participated. Thank you for everyone just shouting us out and giving us love. Please, please check us out, Gardens at NYCHA, more covering in the season. Jay, please close us out.
Oh, I just wanted to say thank you as well. I found this event through Instagram, and it was just a little that I got, which was a lot. It's such a good start to, start to study, and get to know, and get comfortable with my own relationship with my ecology. I'm from the South, and just before. But just going through college, before I left Georgia, I left thinking oh, I don't really have a tradition. I don't have a lot of culture, especially concerning food culture and stuff like that. But being in spaces like this is a reminder. And I just wanted to mention really quick about the cacao. Just learning, that was the most interesting to me, and I just can't wait to learn more about that one, because my sister was doing a cacao ceremony with people in Costa Rica. And she was she felt something tell her not to participate in the cacao ceremony, because it's something that was very sacred to the people on the land. And so they're finding out that cacao, there's an African relationship with cacao too. I'm just blown away. So thanks to the people that presented. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was so beautiful. You definitely brought us home. We did all this to connect with you and to connect with everybody on the line. So So blessed, so very grateful. Thank you all for continuing to have this amazing ancestral foods conversation with us. And we're excited for the next one.
We
So-
are. I just want to shout out one thing. Someone just asked in the chat about a tea ceremony. You know what? We've already gotten that Ancestral Foods Part 3. I'm gonna say exclusively here, yes, we are gonna talk about sugar. You have my word in front of all 43 of you left. We are going to talk about sugar in Part 3. Yes, the tea conversation does continue at Gardens at NYCHA in our sensory wellness in-person workshops. We will be offering more sensory wellness. Our sensory wellness workshop for February is sold out. We have done our best to extend those tickets, but sensory wellness is a workshop that happens year-round for us. Tea is a part of that conversation. Please check us out at GrowNYC, the Instagram page. Please check us out at Gardens at NYCHA at grownyc.org for more information about our workshops and sensory wellness. Thank you, everyone. Good night.